Should we get started?
Sure.
Right.
Yes, please.
Right. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the CDS Lab Research Coordination Network webinar. My name is Cecilia Dome. I'm the principal investigator for the project, and we have a group of wonderful colleagues who are organizing this webinar series. We are currently looking into the Water Nexus. So I'm very happy to have Dr. David Sampson to give a talk on modeling tools today. Dr. Qingwen Cheng from ASU will introduce our speaker. Qingwen, I give the baton to you.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sampson. Well, first, I'm Qingwen Chen. I'm Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture Design School at Arizona State University, and I had this honor to help to curate the water series seminar for the CTS lab. And today is our second speaker of the series, and Dr. Sampson is a senior sustainability scientist at Global Institute of Sustainability and Innovation at Arizona State University, and a research scientist for the Decision Center for a Desert City at ASU. He is architect, a programmer, developer for 4 published biogeochemical forest process models, and the lead developer and the programmer for a WaterSim suite of models, which is his topic, main topic today. And Dr. Sim uses WaterSim for anticipatory scenario analysis research, and a lot of practitioners and academics use the WaterSim to examine the trade-offs in water policy and planning strategies for the Phoenix Metro area. David will talk more about that in today's talk. He oversees development of a coupled web-based food, energy, water model and a visualized tool for this Phoenix area. And he is currently the president of the Phoenix chapter of Arizona Hydrological Society Board of Directors. So, David, welcome, and give the floor to you.
Thank you, Qingwen. Yeah, I didn't want to be president again, but here it is. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm happy to be with you today. We're speaking near and dear to something that's been a big part of my life for the last 12 years. Speaking about WaterSim and how we use it, and some other tools as well. I want to, of course, start with acknowledging the National Science Foundation, who funds all of my work. Today I'm actually going to give you a brief history of WaterSim, because I think probably most of you do not know what WaterSim, but it's been evolving actually since about 2006. I came on board 2008 at ASU, so I picked up the ball in 2008 and carried it forward. I'm going to talk a little bit about the current WaterSim suite that we have here at ASU. And then I conducted some analyses with other researchers. So I'll show you some examples of some of the policies that we might use for sustainable and resilient Phoenix from a couple different papers that we wrote. And then I'll finalize my talk with some gaps in the water, energy, and food nexus research. So I have a few things to say about that, because I am heavily involved in overseeing 5 students right now creating a coupled model for the area for food, water, energy, and it's been challenging but interesting. And then we have a discussion at the end. I'm going to give you a historical context, just because WaterSim has such a rich history. Yeah, and then talk about a little bit of the trajectory of the vision. So I officially note WaterSim 3.0 is the first model that was published and actually really used. It was envisioned as a tool to explore policies and the trade-offs in managing water here in the Phoenix Metropolitan Area. When I say Phoenix Metropolitan Area, I'm talking about 33 cities that are in Maricopa County here. It's a fairly large area with over 4 million people. It's about 4.2 million people right now. The initial model is a county scale model. So it's simulated at the Maricopa County scale. There were 5 policy levers that I'll talk about in a minute. And it was really created for an immersive environment. And it's called the Decision Theater here at ASU. It's a 270-degree surround environment where you to envision tools, to use tools to interact with folks, to come to decisions and create management thoughts and policies. And I want to highlight that really the focus is on the big picture. So this model and these models are not used for modeling water in any of the cities. I mean, they model using typically spreadsheets on the daily basis. And this model really, it runs at an annual time step. It's really about big picture climate and policy implications and how that affects the Phoenix metro area. And the initial model looked simply at groundwater overdraft for the region, which was a very huge problem at the time. So this is an image shows you a couple things. The bottom here shows you the initial decision theater, and you can see folks would come in and sit in these chairs, and you were surrounded by these floor to ceiling screens. Whatever PowerPoints on every individual screen separately. The initial WaterSim then looked like this. This is collapsing them all into one image, but picture each one of these on a separate screen in there. And the initial WaterSim then looked at, you could pick a trace flow of a river from the historical record. You could impact the climate model on what it's doing to the flow. One of the policies also was population growth, and then also agricultural retirement. So for those who undoubtedly aren't aware, retirement of ag lands in order to put in homes has been a big part of the growth here in the Phoenix metro area for decades now. And then some little levers to play with looking at indoor water use. But the main focus, it was always on groundwater overdraft. Well, there are a number of published studies from that work, and I won't go into all these, and you probably can't really read them, and that's not that important. You could look it up if you wanted to, but Pat Gober was involved with most all of them. So then I came along, I worked with WaterSim 3, and then I created WaterSim 4. I took it from the county level to the water provider level. I also converted it from PowerSim, which some of you might be familiar with, into Fortran, which is an archaic language that works really well. It's very efficient at processing data very fast. 33 of the largest water providers, we encompass about 95% of the people in Maricopa County. This model is focused on water supply and rights, but there's no public face to this model. And I did have one publication out of it with some help, some folks at that time. Then we went on to WaterSim 5. We wanted more policies to be able to implement in the model. And we also wanted to look at water demand. So we added a number of modules, a groundwater credit model. So for those of you who undoubtedly aren't aware, we manage groundwater here in the metro area with credits. We don't actually manage physical water. We manage with credits. Added a city model, which is really just a network of how water moves through the city, each city. And then agriculture, a module that added an agriculture model. It looks at how ag is changing in the valley and how it's shifting, the rights are shifting, the lands are shifting, et cetera. Again, this is focused on water demand and increased water policies. We increased the supplies that we could use, water banking, reverse osmosis, and we added an interactive interface to it. And there's a couple of publications here I highlighted that I led illustrating the model, and that Pat Gober and I did on looking at drought, 60-year drought, Megadrop, what that would do to the area. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'll show you some results from that work. I think it was pretty interesting. WaterSim 5 modules. So we have a number of different modules, and I won't focus on the details here, but I just wanted to highlight that credit models, we model at the regional groundwater. We don't model for every individual city. the groundwater, but we do have, the model does a really good job at the regional level, keeping track of all the inflows and outflows, the fluxes in and fluxes out, and then how those are allocated based on their rights. Every water provider then has specific rights to that groundwater, and they can only use those rights. They pump those rights, and you keep track of it. And this image just shows the different surface water systems that we have in groundwater. So we actually have water from the Colorado River here, the Salt River, which comes off the central part of Arizona. Quite a large watershed in the Verde River system. They both provide water rights to the area. We rely on that for about 750,000 acre feet per year. Hopefully acre feet, sorry, I'm not going to translate that to cubic meters. Those are numbers that I'm not that comfortable with, but so we have a number of different supplies here for the model, but predominantly surface water and groundwater. We also have reclaimed water. We have groundwater banking, which we added. We have pumping from various sources, municipal groundwater from separate sources. We have recharge, et cetera. So we come up with total water demand. And I won't focus on this, but I just wanted to show you that it's fairly complex. I always tell folks that WaterSim is not a complicated model, but it is a complex model. It does handle all the different fluxes from supplies to use, and you can actually manage, or you can manipulate all of these trigger points in the model as a management strategy for the water, where the water is going, how it's being used. WaterSim 5 can be seen online, but it was really designed to show also in the decision theater. This is a modified version of the decision theater. They spent several $1 million upgrading it. You can still see they have large screens in there, but it's configured a little bit differently. But it's still shown in the decision theater, where you can bring up separate slides on the different screens, and you can talk about what's going on in an interactive environment. We made it a public face to it by adding just some virtual modules. We have a user interface, and it interacts with the browser, and then that interacts with the web service API, application programmers, and then, no, sorry, I'm going into details here, but a way to access the model itself and show it through a web browser. And we now use that architecture for all the WaterSim models, which means that anyone can access one of the models just via a web browser on a PC, on a phone, on a laptop, on whatever you're connected to the internet with. So from WaterSim 5, I went to WaterSim 6. So WaterSim 6 is the last version of WaterSim. I actually created that version because I wanted to add a couple policies that were near and dear to me into the model that were not in WaterSim 5. In particular, we added land cover and land use drivers to water demand. We added rainwater harvesting, gray water use, and then we actually modeled stormwater capture too. And that then came out in this particular paper, and that came out last year with some folks from ASU looking at WaterSim 6. And that work was based on Sustainable Future Scenarios project. And maybe some of you have heard of that project, but they envisioned 6 different futures, sustainable water futures for the Phoenix Metropolitan Area. And what we did is we parameterized the WaterSim model, WaterSim 6, for 3 of those futures, including the baseline or the business as usual scenario, and then 2 of the other scenarios, so that we could look at how their vision for a sustainable future, how that worked out, how that played out within the water world and water resources. So what are the WaterSim models? We have a WaterSim America model. We have a WaterSim Arizona model, the WaterSim Phoenix model, which is WaterSim 5 at this point. And then I'm working on a WaterSim West model, which will be the last WaterSim that I work on. And I'll talk about all of them in a second. This just shows you how they're all a little bit different, but they're all based on the same web architecture. And they're all for different purposes. And how are they used? Well, So WaterSim America came out several years ago now, maybe 5, I guess. And it was used in rural museums across the country. It's now been in about 20 states. And this work was done in collaboration with the Smithsonian. They saw WaterSim, they liked it. They wanted us to adapt and create one that that they could use in their museum on Main Street exhibit. So we created a model specific for um, traveling around the country. And of course, it uses then data that's accessible or that's relevant, available across the whole country. So it's a totally different data source, data set to drive the WaterSim America model. That's project is completed now, but we reached out to a number of rural folks with the intent to show them how water is managed typically and where their water resources are coming from and how you might manage them and what kind of activities that you might do to create a more sustainable water future for their state. We actually have a kiosk version of WaterSim Arizona, and that too then became part of the Museum on Main Street exhibit from the Smithsonian. And that too traveled around rural museums, but that was specifically in Arizona. And that was a little bit higher resolution model where we broke that into the regions for the state, because of course, as you can imagine, every state, every region, every city has a little bit different water portfolio, a little different ways of managing their water, different water sources, and different demands, different needs. We have a classroom version of WaterSim Arizona, and that, of course, is used for classroom instruction. We have syllabi for that. That's still being used. The Phoenix model, the WaterSim Phoenix model, also is used for classroom instruction. We focus that one 8th grade through high school, typically, and we have teacher training. Through grants, we'd bring in teachers, and we show them the model and show them how to use the model. We provide them with a syllabus, and then they would use that in their classrooms. And I apologize, I can't tell you now how many different classrooms it's been used in. It's been used in hundreds of classrooms now throughout the state. One thing we learned through this whole process is that how you create that interface is very critical to reaching the audience that you're trying to attract or trying to reach. So the museum interface has to be completely different than something you'd have in a classroom, because the museum interface has to stand on its own with maybe self-guided instruction. The classroom version, you would have a teacher up there implementing the model and showing them how to use the model and guiding them. So it's more of a guided application through learning about water and sustainability and the things that you can do to improve your water sustainability. And then WaterSim 5 and WaterSim 6, and then now soon WaterSim West, they're research tools typically also. I mean, they're used for the classroom as well, but they're research tools in our lab for anticipatory modeling and scenario analysis. So again, big picture questions about the way we're using our water, the policies that you might implement to secure a more resilient water portfolio for the city. And then, of course, WaterSim Phoenix is still being shown or used in the decision theater. I'm pretty sure that's still a part of what they do there. I haven't been in the theater though in about a year and a half because of COVID and some other reasons. But I know Michael Crow, which I think most of you know, the president of ASU, is a big fan of WaterSim, and he's told me that before. Of course, now that we have it based on a web application and it's accessible through any device that can access the internet, we have opportunities for a much broader audience to use it or view it and play with it. And so I just provided a couple images here of how it's being used and what's happened with it from classrooms where throughout Arizona principally, but mostly Maricopa County, but also in some of the other counties, teachers using it to teach students about where their water's coming from, where it's going, and how you might manage that water to be more sustainable. it's also been brought to a number of different meetings, conferences, exhibits. I think this one is from the AAAS meeting from several years ago now. You can see we bought these large screens and you can bring it up on the screens. And then I use it in symposium and conferences that I go to, and others do too. So I think we definitely have time for a live demo. I'll bring up maybe one of them because you can see a little bit more closely, and maybe I'll do Arizona. And this should work. I've tested it a couple times and it seems to always work. But maybe you can't see it since I'm not sharing that screen, or can you see it? Didn't think about that.
David, we cannot see.
Yeah.
Only see the slide.
Yeah.
You may be able to switch it if you wanted to change your
Yeah,
screen.
you just put click the share screen and select the screen you are showing the model.
Can I share two at one time though?
Two at one time, no. Zoom can only do one at a time.
I think that's a limitation. Okay, can you see the WaterSim Arizona screen now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So this is the classroom version, where you can see where we set up. We have a number of different policies on the left that students can manipulate, looking at their source of their water, whether it's of surface or groundwater, reclaimed water, and then the efficiency of how you're using that water. Cities and towns, agriculture, industry, and electricity production. So they're broken up that way basically because that's how the USGS broke up their data, and we just used the USGS data. And then you can also play with population growth. In the middle, then we have a sand key diagram showing sources of water and then uses of water. And of course, the green showing what the current use is, and then the red in this case shows the demand that's not met. And I should point out that this is actually for 2050, so it's showing you what it would look like at 2050 with the water that you have available. And then you can play with your policy choices in order to reduce the red in this box, meaning that you're reducing that excess demand to try to make it more in line with supplies. And that's typically how folks would play with it. So we could change the efficiency of water use, and it will run and reduce the size of the red boxes to become more efficient. On the top, then we have these sustainability indices, and we've been working on these for years and years and years. How should they look? Are we conveying the information, that we're trying to convey? And one for the economy, one for the environment, one for groundwater. We have then lines of how it was before and what it is doing now. And you can see we decreased the sustainability needed for the economy, didn't change it for these two. And then we have these other indices here, efficiency of water use indicators, where folks can get some idea of, well, with what we did that improve our situation or not? And then these little helpful hints, you could click on these and get more information about the different what's happening with your choices, whether you made good choices or you made poor choices, and how that's affecting the different sectors of your particular region. So I think that's really all I want to show you with that one right now. But I'll go on and I'll start sharing my other screen. But of course, I'm no longer where I left off, am I? Oh yeah, I am. Okay. So anyways, that was WaterSim Arizona, the classroom version. I'm not going to go to the other versions. You're welcome to see them all online. I used WaterSim 5 and 6 through a Visual Studio programming interface just because I'm lazy, but it really works okay for me to do it that way. So there's the user resources here. You could access phoenix.watersim.org, arizona.watersim.org. They're all online, and then the AZ kiosk.watersim.org, but you have to do a /iPad to see that one. Now those, you don't have to memorize those URLs. You can all be found at the DCDC website. And all you would have to do is go to your browser and type DCDC and ASU, and it would come up. And you can find the WaterSim models that way if you're interested in looking looking at them or playing with them and having some fun with them. So let's shift gears here a little bit. Talked a little bit about the WaterSim and the development of WaterSim and the various versions and what we do with them. But we could also talk about what policies could we implement to secure our water future. So I work in the anticipatory scenario analysis arena, and that's really where you would just you have a model. It's typically a systems dynamics model, and you create a future by manipulating policies either in the present day or at select points in the future dates. And then you end up creating this cone of uncertainty of your analyses because we're not certain about hardly anything anymore in terms of what population growth might be or water use might be, or a number of different factors that impact water demand. And so you can project forward then using bounds on your known important driver inputs and create this scenario space of where there's a very high probability of that's what the future will lie within that space. And some of the work that we've done looking at that already from the past, where we look at changes in the regional aquifer from the initial baseline through time and how that's impacted by, in this case, surface water supplies and increased water demand, typically through increased population growth here. Phoenix Metro is a really fast growing metropolitan region. There are some estimates that we might reach 7 to 9 million people by 2060. So it's really going to be challenging to meet the demands for that many people through time, and how might you do that? This particular analysis just shows typical outputs from some of the multiple scenarios that we run. Much uncertainty, of course, and of course, much of that can be due to differences in the water flows, the traces on the river, the annual flows on the river, and how that impacts your water supplies, for surface water supplies. These heat maps on the bottom, some people find them challenging. I'll go through one of them more closely so you can maybe pick up on what it's conveying. It's taking three-dimensional data and collapsing it into 2D. In this axis, we have surface water deliveries. Here would be a baseline delivery, increase supplies, decrease supplies this way. And then on the x-axis, we have water demand, increased demand and decreased demand on this direction. So typically, then the focusing on the dark blue or the green, that's your groundwater pumping hasn't changed. So the result, the response variable in this case is groundwater pumping, increased groundwater pumping up to 300% change from baseline. So obviously, I mean, it makes sense. You decrease your surface water deliveries, you increase your demand, you're going to have much more groundwater pumping here, shown in the red, and it decreases as you back off from that. So we look at these types of analyses to try to draw strategic insights about what, if you know what future supplies might be or future demands might be, how that might look in the future, at least in this case for groundwater pumping. And then we can look at groundwater credits as well. And I won't focus on that image at the moment. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Megadrop. So as I hope all of you know, we're going into a 22-year drought here in the Southwest. And we've had longer drought periods in the historical record dating back to about 730 is earliest data that I've seen, but we've had 60-year droughts in the past. And so Pat Glover and I wanted to look at what would a 60-year drought do to the Phoenix metro area on the water supply and sustainability here. So we conducted this paper, and we used WaterSim 5, and we looked at a number of different policies. And we looked at population growth management, conservation, or your personal water use, direct reuse of reverse osmosis water, adding water from a yet unknown source. That's what augmentation means. It just, we don't quite know where that source is coming from, but we're assuming maybe we can get a source. And then water banking. And water banking is when you here anyways, you put surface water on the surface of the soil, and then it infiltrates, it percolates into the ground, into an aquifer, and where you can pump it out later. And this particular image just shows you how Arizona has managed this water over time. And I like showing this because people from outside of Arizona don't quite understand. We have a rich history of managing water here since late 1800s. We're very good at managing our water, even though we have a lot of population growth shown here. Our total water use actually went up, but since 1980, it's been declining, even while we've been increasing our population up to, just like I said, we're a little bit over 4.2 million people now, I guess. So we're very good at managing our water. And I want to make sure folks understand, yes, we live in the desert. Yes, we bring in our water from outside sources, but we're very good at managing our water. Now, I know this is a busy slide, and I don't want you to focus on how busy it is, but I wanted to illustrate a little bit about what we did for this paper. In this case, here's the 5 different policies on this left side. We did essentially a sensitivity analysis looking at what every individual policy itself, by itself, what would that do then on the years of adequate groundwater supply. And for those who aren't aware, we are charged with having 100 years of adequate groundwater supply in order to plat a property. So a developer has to demonstrate that they have 100 years of water supply before they can build, before they can develop. And so that's what this, we base our management on that aspect. Every individual policy then shown here with the different variations in growth management, how that impacts groundwater supply, conservation, etc., water banking. And then on the right then, it shows what we did when you do them in combination. So we combine the different policies. This is just groundwater management. This is just population management by itself, where we're looking at 25% reduction in projected growth and how that would impact years of adequate groundwater supply. And the variability here is due to the variability, again, in the climate traces, because we use multiple flows on the river. So it could be high, it could be low. Right now, of course, it's been low for years, but the record indicates that we could have a high flow year. And then you add on top of 25% reduction in growth, you add on top of that conservation measures, that dramatically reduces the variability in the outputs. Add on top of that, water banking, aggressive water banking, again, severely reduces variability, etc. So I have a slide here to list exactly what the strategic insights from that work was. Suggests no single policy or management strategy will see us through a 60-year drought, and conservation is important, but multiple overlapping strategies would be needed. So you could reduce new population growth, stop development on raw desert, which is a big bugaboo for me right now. Build on retired farmlands where you already actually have water rights that could be transferred instead of raw desert that have no water rights. Increase water conservation. Now, you may not know, gains from appliance and water fixture efficiencies, they're diminishing. But you could increase irrigation efficiencies and install xeric landscapes, remove turf, plant native trees, etc. Use all the reclaimed water. And like Grady Gamage says, he's one of our leading water experts here in the Valley. We consider how we use our water. He would argue that we have plenty of water. It's really more about how we use the water that we have. And I agree with that. Sustainable future scenarios. I'm going to speed up just a little bit, looking at the time. We took their 2 scenarios, almost zero waste in this desert wetland, parameterized the model. They have these visions of what land cover land use would look like in 2060 for the different scenarios. Used WaterSim 6, moving it out from 2015 out to 2060, parameterized. What did we find from that work? So we explored centralized water management strategies and decentralized strategies. So decreased reliance on surface water supplies are going to be happening. But they could be offset by increased municipal groundwater pumping. This is in the strategic scenario, the business as usual scenario. This is assuming also 7 million people here by 2060. but we actually had decreased total demand in these scenarios. And I could talk about that later if we have time, why that's the case. Desert wetland and the almost zero waste scenario. So what we found, there's also decreased surface water supply reliance, obviously, but it was offset by alternative water supplies, so non-potable water sources, including gray water, reclaimed water, rainwater harvested. And you would find it maybe difficult to believe, but it does rain here on occasion, and when it does, sometimes it can be significant. So under modest policy implementation and service connection adoption rates, by 2060, alternative supplies could offset about 30% or more of outdoor water demand, and then aggressive policies could actually offset about 80% of outdoor water demand. So I think many of you can imagine outdoor water demand here in the Phoenix metro area and in the West in general can account for 50 to 80% of your total water use at the residential household level. So it's a significant source of water use. Knowledge gaps. I think, somehow I missed a slide, but that's okay. I don't know where that slide went to. That's very funny. So as mentioned, I am overseeing a project that, that's very interesting. That's looking at water, energy, and food challenges here in the Phoenix Metropolitan Area. We have a coupled food, energy, water model system right now, but I've used the model now to look at some more in-depth questions about sensitivity and uncertainty in the modeling. So we know that they're complex systems. You need to use system models in order to understand these food, water, energy systems. They contain hundreds of parameters and time-varying inputs, and there's much uncertainty. So understanding that uncertainty is really important, and understanding what could happen in the future. Here's our study area. It's actually the Phoenix Metropolitan Area here, but it's actually bounded by this, what we call the active management area. And that's that area where groundwater is managed by Arizona Department of Water Resources. We have this coupled model with WEEP, MABIA, and LEAP, and perhaps many of you have heard of these models. MABIA is the agricultural sub-module for WEEP, but this is a schematic of how they're linked together. LEAP, of course, is energy model. WEEP is a water model, and MABIA adds the ag component to it. And we added a statistical model to look at the relative cropping in the area. Conducted a sensitivity analysis, and I looked at some of the functional relationships, and then I did a Monte Carlo uncertainty assessment. And I better speed up a little bit more. Model parameters, they have embedded uncertainty, and some of the most uncertain parts of it is this per capita water use. You can see if this is for Gilbert, Arizona. It changes throughout the year. You can see this is July, very high use in July, of course, much lower use in the winter, and it's been decreasing through time. So the purple is 96 to 2000, and the green is from 2011 to 2016. So per capita water use has been declining over time. Of course, that can largely be attributed to differences in the efficiencies of the appliances and the fixtures that we're using in the house. This bottom panel shows how we're using it in the house. The toilets uses the most amount of water generally, clothes washing, showers, etc. And that too has decreased from time. This is from the this is from Marin d'Orio. You can see it also has decreased through time for each of the uses. But there's other challenges with water use too, because people use water differently, right? This is showing average daily gallons on the x-axis and the histogram, showing that just households use water differently. I mean, there's different number of people, but it's more about habits and personal use of that water. Much uncertainty. Add on top of that population, which really don't know. These are just some simple simulations from WaterSim showing we don't know what the population is going to be. And of course, adding those sources of uncertainty together, we have high uncertainty in water demand. And this is an example from Seattle, Washington. This is the actual consumption through time from 1940 up to 2010, the solid line, black line here, actual consumption. But everyone, especially modelers, make projections, and these individual dashed lines just show you at the time before we got to that period what their projections were. So you can see that water demand forecasts are very challenging. And of course, maybe some of you have seen this from the Colorado River Basin study, a bunch of uncertainty in water demand. This is the baseline. demand estimate, but climate change and all the different scenarios. So the bottom line, we don't know. Now I'm going to skip all this, but just wanted to show you there's an approach. I fit regressions to the different estimates that I created from the Monte Carlo analysis. So I could look at a 1% difference in the default estimate for each of these parameters, in this case, per capita water use. And what does that do on outputs, in this case, municipal CAP water use? CAP is one of the Central Arizona Project water. That's the water that comes off the Colorado River into Central Phoenix via the CAP Canal. We obtained a significant amount of water via that water source, about 1.6 million acre feet annually. What did we find, or what did I find? Percent difference in the default population. Well, you change, if you don't, we don't know what population is going to be, but a 1% difference in that population estimate on the CAP supplies to municipal is like a little over 9 million cubic meters per year. I think that's significant. That roughly is equivalent to 25,000 households here, et cetera. We can look at electrical, how that affects the electrical system as well. Hydro imports, 184 gigawatt hours per year. That's a 1% difference in your intensity estimate for hydropower, et cetera. CAP conveyance, 5 million cubic meters per year just from conveying water along the Central Arizona Project system. So it's been fun looking at that. I'm working on the paper right now for this work. And it's also fun to look at irrigation efficiency. And I see I'm at 9:45. Let's go on to Nexus Gaps. So this is order indifferent. I don't know what the most important aspect would be, but from what I've experienced with the modeling so far, I think energy for food is very important. We don't have much understanding of that. Energy used in the process, what I'm calling here the process thread, or the processing from husbandry to the market shelf. We don't know. Machinery, groundwater pumping, surface water conveyance, transport, how much energy is being used in taking care of the animals and creating the crops and growing the crops, harvesting the crops. And also something else I'm thinking we're ignoring is energy embedded in food waste. If we're throwing away 30% of our food, how much energy are we losing in food waste? Water for food, crop and animal water needs, including processing, irrigation efficiencies. My sensitivity analysis suggests it's very important on water use, total water use at the larger scale. Water and energy balance, saved through green landscaping, native trees, drip irrigation. How does the cooling from having a green landscaping impact your local environment, and how is that impacting how much electricity you use, example for AC or whatever, albedo, vapor, et cetera. And then I'm working with Denver Water. We've done some analyses on irrigation efficiencies, and it's actually shown that some of the highest density houses may use more water than a large single family home, just because of inefficient use of watering and then overwatering. And I know I sped up, but I'm trying to get done in time, and I'm going to call it stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Let's see if we have some questions, or maybe Professor Chingwen wants to make a comment.
No, thank you. This is great to see, even though I know WaterSim, but it's great to see the entire history and how it's applied. I really appreciate your presentation and looking into how this can be. Well, first, I really appreciate that also be used in the K-12 education. I think that's important piece for our reaching to the public, and then how does that influence the policy making. I think for the water, food, energy nexus system, I see the potential of continue developing using this model and system, and I do also acknowledge and agree with those challenges. And so I think that's something our group can continue the conversation with. I'll be curious what other people in other aspects say about this part. So I'll just open up for questions from others. Thank you.
Michael has a question.
Hi, David.
Hi.
That was great, really great presentation. Thank you. I really enjoyed seeing it.
Thank you.
I have two questions. First is maybe whimsical. I mean, you emphasize that you manage water carefully in the face of not having huge resource. And my perception in New York City is that we at least perceive ourselves as having a huge resource. And I wonder if that means that we manage it carelessly, and if you have any insight into whether that's true or not. Like, you know, I know we do have some water conservation programs, but I think in general, we might be pretty careless.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, if you think about it, how close Atlanta was to running out of water a few years ago, if you remember that. But yet they live in the South and it rains a lot there. I think it's just really simply because we have such a long history here and we recognize how fragile life is here and how much we depend on water. And the foresight, so that I didn't get to talk about it, but in 1980, the Groundwater Management Act that had to be installed here was a big part of why we use our water fairly efficiently here. We couldn't build, for those, if you don't know, the CAP canal brings water from Lake Havasu all the way into Tucson along a 336-mile canal. And we couldn't build at the canal. The federal government would not allow funding that canal unless we implemented this Groundwater Management Act. And so I would argue that other than Australia, perhaps, we manage our groundwater better than anybody else in the world. Well, Saudi Arabia, yeah, I shouldn't say that. I think we do very well, a good job of it because of that Groundwater Management Act. So I think you're right, because we know life is tenuous here, that we've just, and have a long history of being here, that we're able to do that.
My second question, a little more technical, is you mentioned scenario analysis that you do, and you know how many variables, parameters you have to vary, and how much uncertainty comes from the ranges in those parameters, possible ranges in those parameters. I'm wondering if you have any systematic way of creating scenarios that you could share. You know, we have a table of parameters, and you know, you create scenarios by checking off certain values along certain parameters and call that a scenario. I'm wondering how you do that.
Right, thank you. That's a great question. So in my work, so I tend to, I bound, I know the important driver variables for a system. I alluded to this, or it was alluded to early. I started my work as I'm actually my background is actually in forest biogeochemical processing. So I'm really an ecologist at heart, but I've moved into the water arena. But always in all my work, we know that there's generally an upper bound and a lower bound for whatever the driving variable is. As long as you know the driving variables for your system, you can bound them. That's what we always do. I bound upper and lower, and then I run multiple steps between them, and then I do those all in combination. So sometimes I have millions of scenarios, which is a large processing challenge, but with fast computers, it's not a problem. And then I use statistical techniques in order to see if there are patterns in the way those scenarios come out. So if you know the important driving variables for your system, and generally you can just bound them by uncertainty in what those would be. Now, the whole issue of parameters, that's something new to me to be thinking about, like how, I mean, sensitivity analysis is needed for any modeling work so that you understand what parameters you might need to look more closely at, make sure you have good data for those parameters, and what parameters you can really ignore. And so I would argue a sensitivity analysis is very important in any work going forward with any kind of systems modeling of any system. So,
Thanks.
thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Roberto has a question.
Oh, hi, David. Thank you
Hi,
very much for the
Roberto.
presentation. I was wondering, is this drought that you have been sensing in Arizona is also happening in the underground water?
So yes, it's affecting the groundwater. So it's always fun to talk about water, because especially from folks not here, because it's so, my head starts spinning because it's so complex. But all the water that we use here, we actually have quite a bit of groundwater here. And it's only because there used to be a lake here millions of years ago. And so all the water most of the water that we're pumping is really historical water that's been in the ground for thousands and thousands of years. We actually have a lot of water. In 2006, our estimate was 61 million acre feet. Now, an acre foot is the amount of water equal to one depth of 1 foot in 1 acre. 61 million acre feet. There's a lot of water. A household uses maybe a third of an acre foot per year here. So we've had this big reservoir of groundwater for the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years, but it's decreasing. And there's problems. And there's certain parts of the valley and in Arizona that's really challenged. And I don't know if you heard about the southeastern part, the northwest. The wells are going dry. Folks are running out of water because they've pumped the groundwater. That's all they have. But there are other parts where it's not so gloomy. So it really depends on where you live and where and how they're managing the water or not managing the water, the groundwater. But in most cases, yeah, our groundwater is decreasing, and it's a problem, and it's not looking that great. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Yeah, that's also. But then I'm thinking that maybe that is a very basic question. But it's, most of the time we're talking about management, we're talking about conservation. But why we cannot try to improve the flow or the production of water somehow?
Why we cannot, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Produce water, increase the, reverse those droughts. Because I think according to the slides that we presented, it seems like it's more suggested to leave the desert the way it is, try to modifying it to avoid this kind of water drought. I don't know if the question is clear. Is there a way we can do to avoid this kind of droughts? Is there anything we can do?
No, I mean, we need to learn to live within the water that we have available to us, and we need to be more careful about the crops. In my opinion, agriculture is too big of an industry here, especially when they plant crops like a tree crop that you can't just fallow for a year or two and not use that water that year. That would be one way of handling a drought. I mean, we are working on that with some districts where they will just fallow land and not use that water for a year or two to get through a drought period. But if it's a crop tree, they can't do that. So really, we need to consider what crops are being planted and used, and how we're able to get through a drought by fallowing land and agriculture. Agriculture uses 70% of the water use in Arizona right now, roughly 75% of the water use in there. In Colorado, it's more like 85%. So ag is a very important industry, but it also uses a lot of water. So anything that we can do to increase agricultural efficiency, or the way we're using water in the agricultural sector, would greatly improve overall water use. So.
Thank you. We have another question from Krishna.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering about, I'm not sure what the best way to sort of describe this problem is, but it's a sort of second order effects in sort of your model predictions, right? So, if you look at, say, what's going on in the Pacific Northwest, right? They have like a large sort of surge in the temperature, but it's not, the temperature isn't the only issue. Now it's like sort of melting some of their, I think there was an article about how it's melting some of their electrical infrastructure, right? So, I mean, we saw the same thing with Texas. Okay, so that you model the temperature, but what actually happens is the pipes freeze, and then the pipes have sustained damage, and there's cost, right? So, it's like you always try to build a system with some slack in it, and that slack accounts for the unknown unknowns, right? The stuff that you haven't modeled. But I was trying to figure out, like, how do you, I mean, there's only so many models you can write, but but how do you account for that? Like, how do you really, when you're making predictions and you're looking at your cone of uncertainty, really the cone is much narrower than that, right? So, because, you really can't get to the margins that you're talking about because so much, so many things, whatever, like become nonlinear at the margins. So how do you think about that? How do you incorporate that kind of uncertainty?
I don't, but they're great. It's a great question. I often wanted to incorporate heat into WaterSim. At one time I had some energy in WaterSim. And I also had salinity challenges and other things, but yeah, I can't address anything like that in WaterSim. It's certainly doable within a modeling. So in my brain, you can model anything if you think broadly enough and you have the right people brought together, you can model anything. Now, how well you model it depends on the data you have, right, to create that model. But I happen to be a systems thinker, so I think in that way. I mean, if you have the data and sufficient data and they're reliable data, and you have the ability to conceptualize how the interactions hold together and how they impact downriver interactions, then you can model it. But I don't handle any of that. Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you.
Sure.
Just quickly chime in to also give a little prompt for our next speaker. We talked about the water management and at kind of municipal scale. So, how we can, I think Arizona reclaim the water is a good potential, especially to supplement the some irrigation use that golf courses we have done. And so, and if we can use the reclaimed water more, I think can help kind of, reduce the pressure a little bit on water use. So our next speaker is the executive director from the City of Scottsdale Water Department. So he will talk about how Scottsdale, they probably one of the most advanced cities here to think about the one water systems and how to reuse the water here. So thank you again, David, for today's talk. I'll give back to Cecilia.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, David, thank you very much for the talk. And I believe we can continue some of the question and conversation offline. And I wish everybody a happy 4th of July and stay safe and stay cool wherever you are.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you,
Have a
David.
wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Neri. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.